My name is Father Giuseppe Marini, and if you were to look for my name in the official chronicles of the Diocese of Rome, you would likely have to squint to find it in the fine print of some archived personnel roster from decades past. I am 71 years old now, a man whose hands shake slightly when I lift the chalice and whose knees protest vehemently when I genuflect. But my mind remains as sharp as the autumn air that sweeps through the cobblestone streets of Trastevere. For 46 years, I have worn the collar, and for 32 of those years, I have been assigned to the exact same parish, Santa Maria del Carmine. It is a modest church, beautiful in that quiet, dusty way that old Roman buildings are, tucked away from the main tourist thoroughfares where the buskers play and the gelato shops command long lines. We have perhaps 400 registered families, a number that has slowly dwindled as the neighborhood gentrified and the old families moved out to the suburbs, leaving me to preach to an ocean of empty wooden pews and the silent statues of saints who seem to be the only ones truly listening to my homilies. I tell you this not to solicit your pity, but to paint an accurate picture of the state of my soul before the event that changed everything. You see, in the ecclesiastical world, there is a career ladder just as there is in the corporate world, though we rarely speak of it aloud. I have watched generations of young priests come to Santa Maria del Carmine. They arrive fresh from seminary, their cassocks crisp and black, their eyes burning with the zeal of the newly ordained. They are charismatic, they play the guitar, they organize youth groups that actually attract youth, and they preach with a fire that makes the congregation sit up and take notice. And inevitably, within 2 or 3 years, the bishop notices them too. They are transferred to the prestigious basilicas near the Vatican, or sent to study canon law at the Gregorian, or pulled into the diplomatic corps of the Holy See. They move up, they move on. And I remained. I was the furniture. I was the priest you called when the real pastor was busy. I was the one who took the 6:30 a.m. Mass on weekdays, a liturgy attended almost exclusively by a handful of devout widows who were awake only because their arthritis would not let them sleep. For decades, I wrestled with a profound and heavy silence in my heart. It is a terrible thing for a priest to admit, but I felt mediocre. I felt that my life was a slow, leaking bucket of wasted potential. I wondered if God had simply forgotten I was down here in Trastevere, celebrating sacraments mechanically, absolving sins in a confessional that smelled of damp wood and mothballs on Tuesday afternoons when no one came. I looked at my hands and saw only the work of a bureaucrat of the divine, a man who stamped papers and said the right words but had no spark, no special charism, no great destiny. I was the backup minister, the invisible shepherd. Before I continue with this story, which is perhaps the most personal confession I have ever made, I wonder if there are others out there who understand this feeling of being overlooked in your own life. I would love to know where you are listening from today, whether you are in a bustling city or a quiet village. Please write your country or city in the comments below. And if you are searching for a place where your quiet faithfulness is valued, I invite you to subscribe to our community here. We are all walking this path together, and sometimes it is the invisible walkers who have the most to teach us. It was against this backdrop of spiritual grayness that the morning of October 10th, 2005 dawned. I was 57 years old then, and the melancholy had settled into my bones like a rheumatism of the spirit. I remember the date clearly because the Roman sky was that particular piercing shade of blue that only happens in October, yet inside the church, the shadows clung stubbornly to the corners. I was preparing for the 6:30 a.m. Mass, going through the motions as I had thousands of times before, vesting prayers whispered without thought. Amis, alb, cincture, stole, chasuble, green for ordinary time. How fitting, I thought bitterly. My entire life is ordinary time. There were perhaps 12 people scattered in the pews, the usual souls, their heads bowed in silent prayer. But as I processed out from the sacristy, my eyes were drawn to a disruption in the usual pattern. Sitting near the front, next to a well-dressed woman who was clearly his mother, was a boy. He could not have been more than 14 or 15 years old. In a sea of elderly women dressed in dark coats, he was a splash of vibrant modernity-wearing jeans and a casual polo shirt, his hair thick and dark, his posture attentive but relaxed. It was rare to see a teenager at any mass these days, let alone the 6:30 a.m. service on a Monday morning. Usually, if a boy that age was in church, He was being dragged there by a grandmother, slouching in the pew and checking his watch every 3 minutes. But this boy was different. He was watching me, not with the bored stare of a captive audience, but with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Throughout the liturgy, every time I looked up from the missal, I met his gaze. It was a look of recognition, as if he knew something about me that I did not know myself. I celebrated the Mass with my usual quiet dignity, devoid of the pastoral energy that the younger priests possessed. I read the Gospel, gave a short, dry reflection, and moved to the liturgy of the Eucharist. When it came time for communion, the boy approached the altar with a reverence that struck me. He didn't just receive the host, he seemed to encounter it. After the final blessing and the dismissal, I retreated to the sacristy, relieved that the duty was done, ready to disrobe and return to the invisibility of my rectory office. I placed the chalice in the safe and began to untie my cincture, the heavy silence of the sacristy wrapping around me again. I was alone, or so I thought, until a soft knock on the heavy oak door broke the stillness. I assumed it was Mrs. Moretti complaining about the flower arrangements again, so I sighed, composed my face into a mask of patient listening, and called out, "Avanti!" The door creaked open, but it wasn't Mrs. Moretti. It was the boy. Up close, he looked even younger, his face fresh and open, but those eyes, dark, deep, and startlingly intelligent, held a weight that belied his age. He stepped into the room with a polite confidence, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the marble floor. "Excuse me, Father," he said, his Italian carrying the distinct, clipped accent of Milan. "May I speak with you for a moment?" I paused, my stole half removed from my neck. "Of course, son," I replied, masking my surprise. "How can I help you? Are you lost? The tourist sites are across the river." He smiled, a genuine warm expression that seemed to light up the dim, wood-paneled room. "No, Father. We are visiting Rome for a family trip, but I am not lost. I came to this parish this morning specifically because I needed to meet you. My name is Carlo Acutis." I hung my chasuble in the closet, turning back to him with a confused frown. "To meet me? Specifically?" I asked, a dry chuckle escaping my lips. "I think you must be mistaken, Carlo. The pastor, Father Rossi, is the one people usually come to see. He is away on retreat. I am I am Father Giuseppe." Carlo nodded, stepping closer, his hands clasped casually behind his back. "I know," he said, and his voice dropped an octave, losing its casual tone and becoming intensely serious. "That is exactly why I am here. You are Father Giuseppe Marini. You are the priest everyone forgets, aren't you?" The air left my lungs. It wasn't an insult. He said it without a trace of malice or mockery. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the back of the sacristy chair. "I beg your pardon," I stammered, feeling a flush of defensive heat rise up my neck. "I don't know what you mean." Carlo didn't back down. He looked at me with a compassion that was almost painful to behold. "The one who is always here, but who everyone looks past," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "The one who celebrates the masses no one else wants. The backup minister. The invisible one. You have been here 21 years, and you feel that your priesthood has been a slow fade into nothingness. You wonder if God has forgotten your address." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. How could this child, a stranger from Milan, articulate the secret dialogue I had been having with myself for decades? These were the exact phrases that haunted my insomnia. "Who told you this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did someone from the parish speak to you?" Carlo shook his head gently. "No one had to tell me, Father. God told me. He asked me to come here this morning because he knew you were drowning in your own insignificance. He wanted me to deliver a message to you." He took a step closer, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The smell of old incense seemed to sweeten, and the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the high window seemed to slow down. "God has not forgotten you, Father Giuseppe. Not for 1 second. The world loves the loud and the visible, but God loves the faithful and the hidden." I wiped a tear that had escaped from the corner of my eye, feeling foolish for weeping in front of a teenager in jeans. "It is hard, Carlo," I confessed, the dam breaking. "It is hard to labor in the dark for so long, and wonder if any of it matters." Carlo placed a hand on my arm, his touch warm and reassuring. It matters more than you can comprehend, he said firmly. And just so you know that this is not simply the imagination of a boy, God gave me a sign for you, a specific one. He paused, looking at the old clock ticking on the wall above the vestment cabinet. Father, exactly 72 hours from now on Thursday morning at 6:30 a.m. your phone will ring. It will be a call from the Vatican, and that call will change the rest of your ministry forever. I stared at him, caught between disbelief and a desperate desire to believe. The Vatican? I scoffed weakly. Carlo, please, I am nobody. The Vatican does not call priests like me. They call the scholars, the diplomats, the stars. They don't call the backup priest of Santa Maria del Carmine. Carlo just smiled, a knowing, serene smile that sent a shiver down my spine. They don't usually, he agreed. But God has been watching you in the shadows for 30 years. He has seen every hospital visit you made when no one was watching. He has heard every confession you sat through when you were tired. He has seen the fidelity. And now he is going to show you how he values it. 72 hours, Father. Just wait. He turned to leave, his high-top sneakers squeaking again, transforming back from a prophet into a regular teenager in an instant. My mother is waiting, he said cheerfully over his shoulder. Ciao, Father Giuseppe. Pray for me, and I will pray for you. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of the sacristy, staring at the phone on the desk, wondering if I had just hallucinated the most profound encounter of my life. I went about my duties for the next 2 days in a daze, the boy's words echoing in my skull. The priest, everyone forgets. It hurt, because it was true. But the promise, 72 hours. Could it be? The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Tuesday came and went with its usual quiet rhythm. Wednesday was a blur of routine visits to the sick and parish administration. By Wednesday night, I was a bundle of nerves, oscillating between skepticism and a fragile, fluttering hope. I told myself I was being ridiculous. A teenager with an overactive imagination had played a prank on a lonely old priest. That was the only logical explanation. The Vatican had no reason to know my name. I went to bed on Wednesday night telling myself to forget it, to wake up and say the Mass and accept my lot in life. But I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. just in case. Thursday, October 13th, 2005. I arrived at the church early. I vested in silence. I checked my cell phone, a bulky, older model that I rarely used, and made sure the ringer was on loud. I placed it on the sacristy table. 6:15 a.m. Silence. 6:20 a.m. Nothing. 6:25 a.m. I began to feel a heavy stone of foolishness settle in my stomach. Of course, it was a fantasy. 6:29 a.m. I stood up to form the procession, reaching for the chalice, resigning myself to the reality of my invisible life. And then, it happened. The harsh, digital trill of my phone cut through the quiet air like a trumpet blast. I froze. The clock read exactly 6:30 a.m. My hand trembled so violently I almost dropped the chalice. I picked up the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Pronto?" I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Father Giuseppe Marini?" The voice on the other end was formal, authoritative, and unmistakably official. "Yes, this is he. This is Monsignor Alberto Castellani calling from the Secretariat of State. I am calling on behalf of His Holiness, Pope Benedict XVI. Do you have a moment to speak?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sacristy walls dissolved. "Yes, yes, Monsignor," I managed to choke out. "Father," the Monsignor continued, "His Holiness is establishing a new special consultative council regarding liturgy and sacramental life in small, struggling parishes. He specifically requested that we find not an academic, but a pastor, a man who has served faithfully in the trenches, away from the limelight, for decades. Your name was brought to his attention through a letter from your dean, describing you as the most faithful, unnoticed servant in the diocese. I listened in stunned silence as he explained the role. I was to remain in my parish, my beloved, humble Santa Maria del Carmine Butte. I would travel to the Vatican once a month to advise the Holy Father on the realities of the priesthood in the shadows. I would be a voice for the forgotten priests. We need someone who understands that the value of ministry is not in the applause, but in the fidelity, the Monsignor said. Would you be willing to serve? Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. Yes, I wept. Yes, I will serve. I hung up the phone and fell to my knees on the marble floor, sobbing not out of pride, but out of an overwhelming sense of being seen. Carlo, the boy had known. God sees everything. It was exactly as he had said. The call changed everything. Not because I became famous, I remained a humble parish priest, but because the burden of insignificance was lifted. I realized that my obscurity was not a punishment. It was a specific calling. But the story does not end there. For a year, I carried the memory of Carlo Acutis in my heart, praying for him daily, wondering what became of the boy with the prophetic eyes. I never saw him again. I assumed he was back in Milan, living a normal teenage life, perhaps forgetting the old priest he had startled in Rome. Then came October 2006, almost exactly 1 year after our meeting. I was reading the newspaper in the rectory kitchen, sipping my espresso, when a photograph on the 3rd page stopped my heart. It was him. The same smile, the same polo shirt. But the headline was a punch to the gut. Teenager Carlo Acutis dies of leukemia at 15. I read the article through a blur of tears. It spoke of his holiness, his love for the Eucharist, his computer skills, and his sudden, aggressive illness. He had offered his suffering for the Pope and the Church. He had died as he lived, with his eyes fixed on something the rest of us couldn't quite see. I sat there for a long time, the paper shaking in my hands. I realized then that when he stood in my sacristy, vibrant and alive, telling me that God had not forgotten me, he was already walking toward his own death. He had taken the time, in the precious final year of his life, to deliver a message of hope to a grumpy, melancholy priest he didn't even know. He had seen my invisible pain and healed it, even as his own body was preparing to fail him. That year, and in the years that followed until my retirement, my ministry was transformed. I served on the Vatican Council, yes, but the real change was in Trastevere. I no longer looked at the empty pews with bitterness. I looked at the widows and saw saints. I scrubbed the floors and saw it as an act of worship. I celebrated the 6:30 a.m. Mass with the joy of a newly ordained priest, knowing that even if only 5 people were there, the entire court of heaven was watching. Carlo had taught me the great secret of the kingdom, that human metrics of success mean nothing to God. The forgotten priests, the invisible mothers, the quiet workers, we are the ones God remembers most. If you are listening to this and you feel small, if you feel that your daily sacrifices are vanishing into a void where no one applauds, please listen to me. You are not forgotten. Your faithfulness in the dark is shining brighter than you can imagine. Carlo Acutis whispered that truth to me, and now I whisper it to you. Thank you for letting me share this burden and this joy with you. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, we are never truly alone. God bless you. I reached out with a trembling hand and clicked the mouse, ending the recording. The red light on the webcam blinked once and died, returning the small, cluttered office of the rectory to its usual dim tranquility. I sat back in my creaking leather chair, exhaling a breath I felt I had been holding for 14 years. It was done. The testimony was recorded. For a long time I had debated whether to commit the story to the digital ether, fearing it might be seen as an act of vanity, a way of attaching my unremarkable name to the meteoric rise of the young blessed. But the urge to speak to the invisible souls, the ones drowning in the silence of their own ordinary lives, had become too strong to ignore. If my confession could help just one priest in a dying parish or one mother in a lonely house, then the exposure was worth the risk. I stood up, my knees popping in protest, a stark reminder that the 71 years I carried were heavy indeed. The rectory was quiet, but it was no longer the oppressive silence of my middle age. It was a peaceful, companionable stillness. I walked over to the window that looked out onto the small courtyard, where a single, gnarled olive tree twisted toward the Roman sun. The Vatican Council meetings had long since ended, for Memmi tenure had lasted 5 years before health issues made the monthly commute too difficult. But the lesson remained. I was still here. I was still the shepherd of Santa Maria del Carmine. A heavy thud from the floor below interrupted my reverie. I frowned. It was Tuesday afternoon, a time usually reserved for the quiet hum of dust settling on the pews. I adjusted my collar, smoothed the front of my black shirt, and made my way down the narrow stone staircase that led to the sacristy. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by open boxes and blueprints, was Father Matteo. He had been assigned to the parish 6 months ago as a parochial vicar, a title that politely masked the reality that he was there to prepare for my eventual retirement. Matteo was 28, sharp-featured, and possessed an energy that bordered on the frantic. He was currently holding a tablet in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other to a bewildered-looking contractor. "No, no," Matteo was saying, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The lighting is all wrong. It's too gloomy like a tomb. We need LED tracks along the cornices. We need to illuminate the frescoes. If we want to attract the walking tours coming from the Piazza di Santa Maria, we have to make the interior pop. It has to be Instagrammable, Giovanni." I cleared my throat, stepping fully into the room. "Father Matteo? Is everything all right?" Matteo spun around, his face flushing slightly. He was a good boy, I knew, but he was afflicted with the same disease I had suffered from, albeit a different strain. I had suffered from the despair of invisibility. Matteo suffered from the desperate need for visibility. He measured his priesthood in numbers, the head count at Mass, the donations in the basket, the likes on the parish social media page he had created. "Father Giuseppe," he exclaimed, swiping a finger across his tablet to dim the screen. "I didn't think you were coming down until Vespers. I was just explaining to Giovanni my vision for the renovation. The diocese has approved the grant for the restoration, remember? We need to modernize. The youth aren't coming because the church feels, well, it feels old." I walked over to the table where he had spread out the architectural drawings. They were ambitious. They involved removing the dark, heavy confessionals, the very ones where I had spent decades absolution sins, and replacing them with glass-walled reconciliation rooms. They involved tearing out the side altars to create a welcome center with coffee machines. "It is an old church, Matteo," I said gently, running a finger over the blueprints. "It has been here since the 17th century. It is supposed to feel old." "But it's empty," Matteo blurted out, his frustration bubbling over. He ran a hand through his gelled hair. "Father, I respect your service, I really do, but we had 40 people last Sunday. 40, in a neighborhood of thousands. We are irrelevant. If we don't change the packaging, the product dies. We need to be dynamic. We need to be seen." There it was again. That word. Seen. I looked at this young man, seeing the panic in his eyes. He was terrified that his life would be wasted in a failing enterprise. He was terrified of being the captain of a sinking ship, while his classmates were speedboats racing toward success. I walked over to the closet, the same closet where I had hung my chasuble on that October morning in 2005, and opened the door. "Matteo," I said softly, "come here." He hesitated, then walked over, looking confused. "What is it? Do we need to move the vestments for the painting crew?" "No," I said. "I want to show you something." I reached into the back of the closet, behind the rows of green and violet vestments, and pulled out a small framed photograph that I kept hidden there. It wasn't a holy card or a relic. It was a simple printout of a digital photo, grainy and slightly faded. It showed a teenage boy in a red polo shirt, smiling with a backpack slung over one shoulder. Matteo squinted at it. "Who is that? A relative of yours?" "That is Carlo Acutis," I said. "He stood right where you are standing now, wearing sneakers that squeaked on the marble. He was 14 years old." Matteo's eyes widened. The name was famous now, of course. The tech-savvy teenager who was on the fast track to sainthood. "Blessed Carlo was here? In this sacristy?" "He was," I replied, placing the photo on the table atop the blueprints of the LED lighting systems. "And do you know why he came here? He didn't come because the lighting was good. He didn't come because we had a coffee bar or a welcome center. He came because he was looking for Jesus, and he found him in the silence of the 6:30 a.m. Mass." I turned to face my young curate. "You want to fill the pews, Matteo. That is a noble desire. But you are trying to fill them with tourists and spectators. You are trying to compete with the world on the world's terms. You want to make us loud, so people will look at us." I took a step closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, just as Carlo had done to me. "But the people who truly need us, the broken, the lonely, the ones who wake up at 4 a.m. crying because their life has fallen apart, they don't need LED lights. They need the shadows. They need a place that is quiet enough to hear the voice of God. They need to know that when they walk in here, they aren't a number in your spreadsheet, but a soul in the presence of the eternal." Matteo looked down at the photo of the boy, then back at me. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking very young and very tired. "But if we don't modernize, Father, won't we disappear? I don't want to be the priest who presided over the funeral of this parish." "We are not a business, Matteo," I whispered. "We are a lighthouse, and a lighthouse doesn't run around the island looking for boats to save. It just stands there, shining faithfully, even when the sea is empty, especially when the sea is empty." I picked up the blueprints for the glass reconciliation rooms. "Leave the confessionals," I said firmly. "The wood smells of mothballs and dampness, I know, but it also smells of 300 years of forgiveness. People need to feel safe to whisper their darkness. They don't want to be on display in a fishbowl." Matteo was silent for a long time. He looked at the blueprints, then at the old cracked plaster of the sacristy walls. Finally, he looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance recede, replaced by a glimmer of understanding. "You really believe that's enough?" he asked, his voice small. "Just being here?" "I know it is," I smiled, thinking of a phone ringing at exactly 6:30 a.m., because God loves the hidden things, and sometimes the most important appointments in history are kept in empty rooms. I patted his cheek, a gesture of paternal affection I hadn't realized I was capable of. "Now, tell Giovanni to go home. We have a mass to prepare for. Mrs. Moretti will be here in 20 minutes to arrange the flowers, and if you move her vases, she will have your head on a platter, LED lights or not." Matteo let out a short, startled laugh. "Yes, Father." As he turned to dismiss the contractor, I picked up the photo of Carlo and placed it back in the closet. My hand was shaking again, but my heart was steady. The video testimony I had just recorded upstairs would go out into the internet, a message in a bottle cast into a digital ocean. I didn't know who would find it, but looking at Father Matteo, who was now calmly folding up his ambitious plans, I realized that perhaps the message had already been delivered to the one person who needed to hear it most. The work continued. The invisible walkers were still walking, one foot in front of the other, all the way home. The weeks that followed the uploading of my testimony were not marked by the fanfare that Father Matteo might have expected. There were no news crews parked on the cobblestones of Trastevere, nor did the Vatican calling regarding a promotion. The video, titled simply "The Priest Who Was Forgotten," drifted into the vast digital ocean. For a time, I assumed it had sunk like a stone, unseen and unheard, much like the majority of my own life. But then the letters began to arrive. They did not come to the rectory door, but to the inbox of the parish email account that Matteo managed. At first, it was a tricklier message from a rural pastor in Nebraska who felt like a ghost in his own town, a note from a nun in a cloistered convent in the Philippines who struggled with the silence, an email from a mother in London who felt invisible to her own family. Matteo would print them out and bring them to me in the evenings, his earlier obsession with going viral replaced by a hushed reverence. We would sit in the dim light of the study, reading the voices of the invisible army. There were thousands of them. My small confession had become a rallying cry for the overlooked, a reminder that the kingdom of God is built not on the peaks of mountains, but in the quiet valleys where no one else looks. By the winter of that year, my health began to decline rapidly. The tremors in my hands grew violent enough that I could no longer safely hold the chalice, and my legs, which had marched faithfully for 70 years, finally refused to carry me up the altar steps. It was a bitter pill to swallow, becoming a spectator in the sanctuary where I had reigned as the silent king. I was forced to retire from active ministry, confined to the rectory and the first pew of the church. The climax of my life did not happen with a thunderclap, but in a moment of quiet, profound symmetry. It was a Tuesday morning in November, a year after I had stopped Matteo from turning the church into a disco. The rain was lashing against the stained glass, turning the interior of Santa Maria del Carmine into a cavern of gray shadows. It was 6:25 a.m. I sat in the front pew, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, my rosary clicking softly in my shaking fingers. The church was empty, save for Mrs. Moretti, who was lighting a votive candle in the corner, and two other elderly souls huddled against the cold. It was the exact same scene as that morning in 2005. The same emptiness, the same silence. The sacristy door opened. Father Matteo emerged. He was not checking a tablet. He was not looking around to see if anyone important was watching. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands folded in prayer, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. He wore the green vestments of ordinary time, the same ones I had worn for decades. He moved to the altar, kissed the stone, and turned to the empty rows. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he intoned. His voice was not the booming projection of a man seeking attention. It was the soft, steady voice of a shepherd speaking to his flock, however small. I watched him, this young man who had once been so terrified of irrelevance, and I saw that the transformation was complete. He was no longer performing. He was praying. He had learned the lesson of the empty room. He had learned to be a father to the shadows. As he raised the host during the consecration, the bell rang out once, twice, 3 times. In that silence, I looked toward the side of the church, near the pillar where the boy had sat so many years ago. The air shimmered, just for a heartbeat. I did not see an apparition in the dramatic sense, no blinding light or angelic choir, but I saw him. Carlo. He was leaning against the pillar, wearing that same red polo shirt, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He was looking not at me, but at Matteo holding the Eucharist. Then he turned his gaze to me. He didn't speak, but his expression was one of pure, radiant joy. He nodded, a simple gesture of confirmation. "It is done, Father. The torch is passed. You are seen." A tear slid down my cheek, hot and final. I closed my eyes, and a peace unlike anything I had ever known settled over my chest, heavy and warm. The fear of being forgotten, the anxiety of a wasted life, the ache of mediocrity, it all evaporated like mist in the morning sun. I realized then that my life had not been a series of missed opportunities, but a long, quiet conversation with God that was finally coming to an end. I did not die that morning in the pew, though perhaps a part of me did. I lingered for 3 more weeks in the rectory, drifting in and out of sleep, tended to by Matteo, who sat by my bedside reading the Psalms. He told me that people were still watching the video, that pilgrims had started to come to Santa Maria del Carmine, not to take photos, but to sit in the silence I had defended. On my final afternoon, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a long golden beam across the floor of my room. Matteo was holding my hand. I squeezed his fingers, my voice barely a whisper. "The lights, Matteo," I rasped. "Keep the lights low." He smiled, tears standing in his eyes. "I will, Father. I promise. Just the candles." "Good," I breathed. "God is in the shadows." I closed my eyes one last time. The darkness took me, but it was not the darkness of the tomb. It was the velvet darkness of the confessional, the comforting darkness of the womb, the holy darkness of the sanctuary before dawn. And then, from the center of that silence, a phone began to ring. It wasn't the harsh digital trill of my old cell phone, but a clear, resonant bell calling me home. "Pronto?" I answered in my soul, and the voice on the other end was not a Monsignor, nor a bishop, nor a pope. It was a voice I had known all my life, though I had never heard it so clearly until now. "Giuseppe," the voice said, warm with infinite recognition. "Welcome. I have been watching you. I have seen everything. Come in, good and faithful servant. You are invisible no more." The silence in the rectory bedroom was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic guttering of the candle flame Father Matteo had promised not to extinguish. He stood by the bedside for a long time, watching the face of the man who had been both his tormentor and his teacher. In death, the lines of worry and the furrowed brow of the bureaucrat of the divine had smoothed out, leaving Father Giuseppe looking younger, lighter, as if the heavy vestments of his invisibility had finally been removed. Matteo reached out and gently closed the old priest's eyes. He picked up the rosary that had slipped from Giuseppe's fingers, the beads worn smooth by decades of friction, and placed it in his own pocket. Then he walked to the window. The Roman dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in the same piercing shade of October blue that Giuseppe had described in his story. Down in the courtyard, the gnarled olive tree stood indifferent to the loss, twisting toward the light. The funeral, held 3 days later, was the final lesson Giuseppe would teach his young curate. Matteo had expected a quiet, mournful affair, a gathering of the few remaining widows, and perhaps a representative from the diocese. He had worried about the optics of an empty church for a man who had served so long, but as the bells of Santa Maria del Carmine began to toll the heavy, slow rhythm of the Requiem, the doors opened, and the world came in. They did not come with cameras. They did not come with tour guides or selfie sticks. They came in silence. There were hundreds of them. They filled the pews, then the side aisles, and finally, they spilled out onto the cobblestones of the piazza. There were the elderly women of Trastevere, yes, but there were also young men with tattoos, tired-looking nurses still in their scrubs, businessmen clutching briefcases, and teenagers with headphones around their necks. They were the invisible army. They were the people who had watched a trembling old man on a grainy YouTube video say, "You are not forgotten," and had felt a lifeline thrown into their drowning souls. Matteo stood at the altar, vesting in the purple of mourning, and looked out at the sea of faces. He saw no judgment, no demand for entertainment, no need for LED lights or glass walls. He saw only a profound, collective hunger for the sacred. He realized then that Giuseppe had been right all along. They hadn't come for a show. They had come because this was the place where the shadows were safe, where a man had lived faithfully in the dark so that he could hold a lantern for them. When it was time for the homily, Matteo stepped up to the ambo. He looked down at the simple wooden coffin, unadorned save for the book of the Gospels and Giuseppe's stole. He cleared his throat, but the polished theological reflection he had written died on his lips. "Father Giuseppe," Matteo said, his voice echoing in the stone vaults, worried that he was a failure because the world did not know his name. He thought he was the furniture. Matteo paused, fighting the constriction in his throat. But he was not the furniture. He was the foundation, and a foundation is always invisible, buried in the dark, holding up the entire house. He looked directly at the contractor, Giovanni, who was standing near the back, hat in hand. "There will be no renovations," Matteo announced softly, yet his voice carried to the furthest corner of the nave. "We will not brighten the frescoes. We will not tear out the confessionals. We will leave the shadows exactly where they are, because it is in the shadows that we find the light we actually need." The years that followed flowed like the Tiber steady, murky and persistent. The frantic energy that had once defined Father Matteo softened into a quiet, enduring rhythm. The viral fame of Giuseppe's video eventually faded, as all digital things do, but the parish did not die. It changed. It became a sanctuary for the overwhelmed. Matteo grew older. His hair thinned, and the first signs of arthritis began to plague his own knees. He became the priest who took the 6:30 a.m. Mass. He became the one who sat in the damp, mothball-scented confessional on Tuesday afternoons, listening to the sins of a new generation. He stopped counting the heads in the pews. He stopped checking the parish analytics. He simply served. One rainy Tuesday in November, nearly 2 decades after Giuseppe's passing, Matteo was in the sacristy, preparing for the early Mass. The church was empty, the rain drumming a melancholy beat against the roof. He felt a familiar pang of weariness, that old ghost of insignificance whispering that perhaps he should have done more, achieved more. He opened the vestment closet. Taped to the inside of the door, yellowed with age and curling at the edges, was the printout of the boy in the red polo shirt. Next to it, Matteo had taped a small prayer card of Father Giuseppe Marini. Matteo smiled, touching the face of his old mentor. "Pray for me, Giuseppe," he whispered. "The knees are bad today." He put on the green chasuble, ordinary time. Always ordinary time. As he walked out onto the altar, the church was dim, lit only by the altar candles and the red sanctuary lamp. But as he bowed before the tabernacle and turned to face the nave, he stopped. Sitting in the front row was a young girl, perhaps 15, with bright pink hair and a heavy backpack. She was looking at him with an intensity that cut through the gloom, a look of desperate, searching hope. She wasn't looking at the architecture. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking for a father. Matteo's heart swelled with a joy that had nothing to do with success and everything to do with fidelity. He knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was the invisible shepherd, standing watch in the grey dawn. He opened his arms, the heavy green fabric draping like wings, and smiled at the girl. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The Mass began. The world outside rushed on, loud and bright and forgetting. But in the quiet church of Santa Maria del Carmine, the light burned on, faithful and unseen, all the way to the end.